11 weeks of protests, but as it stands, it's all falling on deaf ears. For the 11th week in a row, hundreds of thousands of people across Israel took to the streets to protest the controversial judicial reforms and the Netanyahu government, which is set to pass through several highly contentious laws this week. These include giving the government full control over judicial appointments and would ban the high courts from exercising judicial reviews over the proto-constitutional basic laws of Israel. Another law that may be passed is the so-called Deri law. This would allow Shas party leader Aryeh Deri to serve in the coalition after he was banned from doing so by the Israeli High Court. While supporters of Netanyahu say that the reforms are a necessary move for an outdated system, the thousands protesting are fearful Israel is slipping down a non-democratic path. But is one side correct, or do both sides have a valid argument and thus a compromise is necessary? With over 100 IDF reservists refusing to show up for duty to protest, are these protests now becoming a danger to Israeli security? And who is to blame, the reservists or the Netanyahu government? Will these protests actually have an impact, or is it just background noise to a bill that is destined to be passed? What's next for the judicial reforms?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. What is next for the judicial reforms? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we take it from there. So Professor Zimmermann, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Well, we are not talking only about judicial reform. We are talking about a coup d'etat practiced by the government against the system that existed until now. And this is what it's all about.
Okay. Weitmann, your thoughts?
Well, I think that the government has got full democratic legitimacy to undertake constitutional reforms and bring back balance to the relationship between the different institutions of the states, which have been tilted towards the judiciary. Yet, I'm very concerned about what's happening. I think it's very, very important to foster understanding and compromise, because these are the rules of the game, and it's important that everybody accepts them as much as possible.
Okay, last but definitely not least, Dr. Michael Oren, your thoughts?
Well, clearly we needed review and reform of our judicial system of the Supreme Court. We knew this in Knesset years ago. The way judges are chosen, the scope of the court, the ability of the Knesset to override decisions of the court, all had to be reformed. The question is, how do you do the reforms while maintaining the principle of judicial review, which is the pillar of any true democratic process in the world? Currently, the government's position, its program, does not maintain judicial review, and that is the great threat.
Okay, gentlemen, and from this point onwards, let's feel free to interact. So there's much talk now on potential compromises, plural, even potential unilateral compromise, the coalition toning down itself. But overall, Dr. Oren, you'll be first. Is the coalition being too greedy? Is the opposition wrong to reject engaging in talks without preconditions?
Well, I think as your reporter said earlier, everyone's wrong and everyone's right. And clearly we need a compromise. I see that the coalition has just sort of blinked tonight by agreeing to sort of drop its demand that the government have exclusive right to appoint judges. The government will only appoint 2 judges, and the rest of the judges will be appointed by a joint committee. That's the beginning. But still you have to determine whether you need all 11 or 15 judges to overturn a piece of legislation, or a smaller majority, and then determine what is the number of members of Knesset you need to override. Right now it's a 61. 61 is the minimum number of members of Knesset you need for any decision, and therefore, if the 61 members of Knesset can override the Supreme Court, there is no judicial review. Therein, again, lies the problem.
So, Professor Zimmermann, is it just a matter of technicalities, of rhetoric, of semantics, or are we talking about 2 conflicting worldviews that simply cannot meet in the middle?
Well, I'm talking as an historian with the historical experience telling me that it is a systemic crisis. It's not only a matter of details of a kind of a compromise that we try to achieve. We are talking about a basic decision about the nature of Israeli democracy. And I don't see how any compromise can be reached. I think the best thing to do is to reconsider the whole idea of reform, not only the reform of judiciary, but the other reforms that are proposed now, and start to think, if at all, about a constitution for the state of Israel. We lack a constitution, and we have a need to reform very much, not only the judiciary, but basically the situation in which Israel is an occupying country in occupied territories. So we have a lot to do before we start talking about the details of a judiciary reform.
Amir, Weitmann, you're listening to Professor Zimmermann here. And correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds as if the protests are not merely against the judicial overhaul, but rather against the government.
Right, that's completely true. We could just hear that in Professor Zimmermann's words. This really has very little to do with the reform in and of itself. And in other words, there may be disagreements as to the details of the reforms, but this is not the issue. The issue is that at the core, we are seeing anxiety among, I would say, center-left secular Israelis who feel that Israel may be drifting towards some sort of a religious dictatorship. That's really what stands at the core of what we're saying. It has very little to do with the judicial, with the proposed reforms themselves. I think that as far as the reforms are concerned, I think we could, if there was goodwill, which there isn't, but if there was goodwill, I think we could probably reach an agreement quite easily, because the distance between the two sides' proposals and the people who are reasonable on both sides, right? The distance is not that great, if at all. So we could reach a deal. Unfortunately, extremist elements, especially on the left, are now bent on destroying the ability of everybody of living together. I think the coalition has got no choice but to make single-handedly compromises to try to calm down reasonable people on the other side. I hope there still are some like that. No choice really, because we can't really have 30 or 40% of the population feeling that the state is about to be transformed into a dictatorship. Although I think it's ludicrous, but it doesn't matter. We can't really afford to have these people feeling like that, and therefore we need to compromise.
Well, Professor Zimmermann, I'm circling back to your previous statements. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, accusing the protesters at some point, or the opposition leaders, of seeking a constitutional crisis, of pushing the boundaries so much so that it will reach to that point. Is it necessary, perhaps, to reach to such an abyss in order to move forward, as you're suggesting, perhaps discussing a constitution?
The problem is that the provocation comes from the government or the new coalition. They start a new system for the state of Israel. And this is why the other side is defending itself and defending the whole society against this kind of a revolution or coup d'etat on the part of the government. If we talk about extremism, I think there's much more right-wing extremism than left-wing extremism in Israel. The Israeli left-wing, so-called left-wing, those who try to defend the principles of liberal democracy are, in their majority, of course, far away from extremism. They are just afraid from the situation that is coming up, a situation in which liberal democracy is going to be substituted by illiberal democracy. We have some good examples. Hungary is one, and from the history, we can bring also other examples.
Dr. Oren.
Well, I think that this crisis is multifaceted and multi-layered. Yes, on the surface, it's about reforms. It's about the future of Israeli democracy, but it cuts much deeper than that. You know, I live in South Tel Aviv on the border of Jaffa, and I talk to my neighbors. They don't see this crisis being about democracy and reform in the Supreme Court. They see it a matter of an embittered, embattled, mostly secular Ashkenazi elite that is rallying around the Supreme Court because it refuses to relinquish power to another part of the country, which is more religious, more traditional, very Eastern Mizrahi, that cares less about being a normal state than it does about being a Jewish state. So it's a very deep crisis between two different Israels. And indeed, we could come to clash, and I'm personally very afraid about the possibility of actually violence between these two Israels. I think we're on the verge of that. And I would call on both sides to remember our history. Professor Zimmermann talked about our history. Let's remember the history of 70 CE, when the Romans were surrounding Jerusalem and the Jews inside the city were fighting one another. We have tremendous crises that we have to address, not the least of which is Iran nuclear threat. And we have to gain some sense of national unity and some type of open dialogue.
Well, statistically, we are in the dangerous period, so to speak, if we're judging by the previous two Jewish kingdoms. We're nearing the end of the first part of our discussion. Amir Weitmann, you're definitely reiterating the need for a step forward on behalf of the coalition, but do you think it will be enough for the opposition, or will the opposition be taking a step back and asking the coalition to take another one?
That's really the question, because I'm talking to ministers, I'm talking to Knesset members, I'm talking to everybody really, and I can tell you on the right-hand side, it's clear everybody wants to compromise. So far, unfortunately, nobody's taking the hand. We're seeing fanaticism on the other side from people who are essentially refusing anything. And it's very, very difficult under such conditions to reach an agreement when essentially people are denying the aspirations of the right wing, which have created this situation to start with, because people have been frustrated for 30 years now that the Supreme Court and the judicial system in general has trampled over the democratic rights of the Israeli people, and we're fed up with this. So we want to change that and restore democracy. Unfortunately, the other side is not willing to come one step towards us, and we need to change that. What we need is to foster dialogue and to try to have everybody coming one step towards the other. And if we don't do that, then I agree with Michael Oren, we are in grave danger, and we need to stop that whilst it's still possible.
Okay, gentlemen, we do need to take a very short break there, but once we get back, of course, we will listen to what Professor Zimmermann has to tell you, and whether we can find a two-state solution for the Jewish state. 2 minutes and we're back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Professor Moshe Zimmermann, Amir Weitmann, and Dr. Michael Oren. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for staying here. We're also, of course, staying on topic. But before we get back to our conversation, after threatening, now comes execution or action, rather. Reservists refuse to serve, and the Prime Minister is not really on board with that. Let's take a listen to what he had to say in today's cabinet meeting.
We will not accept anarchy. Some call for roadblocks, for refusals, for blood in the streets, for harming public figures. We will not accept this, and we will not accept violence from any side. Without turning a blind eye, without making assumptions. I expect the Chief of Staff and the heads of the security establishment to firmly fight the refusals. There's no place for refusals in the public discourse. A country that wants life cannot put up with such phenomena, and we will not put up with them.
Okay, gentlemen, another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. When is it moral to disobey the law? Dr. Michael Oren, please take the lead.
Well, very clear. It's legal to disobey a patently illegal order. If someone in the army tells you to destroy a Palestinian village, just as a random example, that's an illegal order which a soldier not only can disobey, but actually has to disobey according to Israeli law. To refuse to serve on the basis of a political position is against the law. And in the past, Israelis have gone to prison as conscientious objectors. If people want to pay that price, they can pay that price. But refusal to serve should remain illegal.
Professor Zimmermann, your thoughts?
The law in itself has to be just. In order to disobey a law, you have to be convinced that the law is just. Basically, if you have a constitution, you have a framework. Without a constitution, you have to decide for yourself whether you can obey the law or not. I'm not talking about a dictatorship. There it is, of course, obvious that you can't obey the law or should not obey the law. But even in a system which calls itself democracy, you have to consider whether it is based on justice or not.
Amir Weitmann, your thoughts?
Yeah, in principle, I agree with Michael Oren and Professor Zimmermann. At the end of the day, there's a very famous case from the 1950s, I believe, when Israeli soldiers were engaged in a terrible incident where many Arab civilians were killed. And the Supreme Court said that this is a case where there's a black flag hovering above the order to fire. And this is the sort of thing which any rightful and honorable and moral person should refuse to do.
Okay, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. So, should the IDF stay out of it? Should be a sacred cows, so to speak, or do reservists have a moral obligation to take a stand, Mr. Weitmann?
Well, I think as much as is possible, the army has to be out of the political debate in Israel. That's always true, by the way. It's not only true in Israel, it's true everywhere, but certainly in Israel, where we have extremely serious issues of life and death, not only on an individual level, but on a national level. We need to have a functioning army, and therefore it's important to keep the army, the armed forces, security forces out of the political debate at all, entirely.
Doctor.
And any attempt to bring them into the political debate should be seen as being illegitimate.
Dr. Oren.
Well, on one hand, of course, the army has to stay out of politics. Otherwise, it just simply wouldn't be an army. It'd be something what we had like in 1948. We had the left-wing Palmach and the right-wing Irgun, and we wouldn't have a sovereign national army. On the other hand, Israel is a social contract. It's a Lockean social contract, and that social contract determines that we, the citizens of Israel, will fight the wars and pay the very high taxes, providing our government convinces us that our cause is just and that everyone is paying that taxes, everyone's sharing the burden. And it's very important for any government, whether right, left, up, or down, to ensure that it can continue to convince Israelis that it's worthwhile to adhere to that social contract.
Professor Zimmermann. Well, we are living in a system in which the army is the people's army. The army as an institution should be neutral, but the people who serve in the army can't be neutral. They are serving as citizens. As citizens, they raise their voice. This is the case at the moment, and I don't understand why the Prime Minister is afraid of this kind of resistance or disobedience or any criticism of the policy taken up by the government.
So on that note, I want this gentleman to take a listen to some of the protesters last night for the 11th consecutive week heading out to the streets of Israel to protest, not showing any sign of slowing down. Let's take a quick listen.
Okay, we know that us as a group, as a minority, we will be the first to be harmed. Already some rules are against us, and there are going to be some more. And I'm worried not about myself, but also about my daughters and my grandchildren. And we want to keep Israel democratic and liberal.
So, Professor Zimmermann, circling back to what you said right now, is civil disobedience undermining or underlying Israeli democracy at this point in time?
At the moment, we have a situation in which two religions collide with each other. The right wing and the left wing, these are equivalent to two religions, and each religion believes in its religion is not going to make a compromise on it. Now, civil disobedience means in this situation that those people who fear of the outcome of the reforms or the changes proposed by the government try to raise up their voices. This is a basic element in liberal democracy, and this is why I believe that this kind of protest is, I think, support, a real support for liberal democracy, not something which should be interpreted as doing something against Israeli democracy or against the legal authority.
Amir Weitmann, what do you think?
Well, before even this government was started actually working as a government, just after the elections, we can already remember that former Prime Minister Lapid was already demonstrating. So, demonstration really started immediately after the elections. So it's a little bit more complicated than what Professor Zimmermann is saying. I think there is here clearly a refusal to accept the result of those elections. There is liberal, free, and open and fair elections, right? There is a refusal to accept from a certain part of society that they may be in minority and that the majority has got the democratic right also to take decisions. This is very serious because we are here seeing people who, in the name of democracy, are really undermining democracy. So I think
this is exactly what you proposed. What the government proposes to undermine democracy in the name of democracy.
Democracy is, first of all, the rule is a system upon which people make decisions based on majority rule. It's not only that; it's a lot of other things: separations of powers. It's freedom of the individual. It's a lot of things. But it's first of all the people who have got the right to make their own decisions. That's independence, sovereignty, and democracy. And this is really what we're seeing here is a refusal to accept this. It's very serious. So we need to come together and to find compromises socially and to understand each other's fears and needs and try to come everyone towards the other, because otherwise we are in a very, very serious situation. So for the fourth time tonight, I want to reiterate that we need to reach a compromise and everybody has to play his own part in reaching a compromise. If everybody is going to stay in extreme positions, we are going straight into the wall. We need to make compromises.